Today we're going to look at an overview of civil rights. We're going to look at it from Reconstruction, kind of a recap, and then all the way up through Nixon. Let's first look at a brief history of the civil rights in the United States. Remember, after the Civil War, there's some division among leaders about what to do with the newly freed slaves. A lot of abolitionists were still pretty racist. They still believed blacks were an inferior race. The 14th and 15th Amendments were passed, and they were notable in that they granted black men citizenship and suffrage, respectively. However, with the Compromise of 1877, which established President Hayes as the next president, military reconstruction was ended in the South. Most of the South after that reverts to discrimination, oppression. That's often referred to as the Jim Crow South, which basically legalizes segregation. It's going to leave blacks economically disadvantaged and completely lacking in political power. There are a few black leaders early on who pushed for change. Booker T. Washington is in the top right corner there. He believed that African Americans should gradually gain their rights. He's not going to push for immediate integration. You want to associate him with the Atlanta Compromise, which is a speech in which he tells basically African Americans to accept segregation, to work on improving themselves. He's a big believer in education, so you want to associate him with the Tuskegee Institute. And he believed that through education, whites would slowly then accept them into society. On the flip side, you have W.E.B. Du Bois. Someone once told me W.E.B. should stand for Wants Equality for Blacks, a way to remember that. Du Bois is in the bottom right-hand corner. He's going to help found the NAACP, which is still around today, a powerful organization which is going to fight for civil rights and to end racial discrimination. There's a lot of conflict between Booker T and W.E.B. You also want to know Marcus Garvey, who's in the bottom left. Marcus Garvey is a leader of the Back to Africa movement, the colonization that basically encouraged blacks to return to their land of their ancestry. It's kind of a, we need to form our own society and go back. So those are some major early leaders, but let's look at how we got to the civil rights movement. So there are numerous causes of the civil rights movement that kind of make it the prime time starting in the 1950s and beyond. Remember, they had just fought World War II, and many African Americans had served in the military with distinction. We've got the Tuskegee Airmen at the bottom. While serving in Europe, these men and some women realized that they faced very little discrimination in Europe. A lot of Europeans, they were viewed as heroes, saving them. They didn't face the same discrimination, and it opened their mind to the possibility that they could have a society without racial discrimination. Also remember, the Nazis are essentially a white supremacy movement, and so a lot of opposition to Nazis is going to be opposition to that white supremacy mentality. We also have the GI Bill. Remember, if African Americans serve in the military, they're eligible for the GI Bill. Some will face discrimination in trying to get what they're rightly owed from the GI Bill, but a lot of them will take advantage of the educational opportunities. So they'll gain basically the education that would qualify them for better jobs, but they're going to find themselves unable to attain the jobs because they're going to see basically they're discriminated against in the workforce. That's going to lead to discontent and call for change. We also, in 1947, have Jackie Robinson is breaking the color line in sports. Very famous moment in history. He's going to become the first African American to play on a Major League Baseball team, the Dodgers, I believe, kind of showing that they can have opportunities, they can be integrated. 1 year later, after Jackie Robinson, President Truman is actually going to integrate the military. Remember, even though blacks have been serving in the military all the way back to the Civil War, they've been serving in separate, segregated sections. Now I'm forgetting the word for that. Embarrassing. But essentially, now we're going to have full integration. Blacks and whites can serve together in the military in the same units. There we go. Truman will also attempt to pass some civil rights legislation, but he's going to be backed by the Southern Democrats, who are a constant problem for the Democratic Party in attempts to pass civil rights legislation. We also have the Great Migration, remember, for a time period during World War I, and then also during World War II. We have many African Americans moving north to the cities. They're going to join the Democratic Party, which is going to give them significant political power, way more political power than in the South, where they are basically having trouble voting. They are facing poll taxes, grandfather clauses, and other things that prohibit them from voting. But when they get up north, joining the Democratic Party because of a lot of FDR's policies, which benefit them, they're going to get a larger role, larger voice. And then lastly is going to be the Cold War. Remember, the Cold War, America pits itself as essentially the voice of freedom, fighting against communism. And segregation, racial discrimination doesn't match the message of freedom. And so a lot of people are going to take advantage of that. So let's look at the civil rights movement. The early civil rights movement kind of takes place under both Truman and Eisenhower, although mostly under Eisenhower is going to be more of the enforcer. We have the famous case of Brown versus Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas. It goes to the Supreme Court, the Warren Court, which is going to be that liberal court we talked about with Kennedy and Johnson. The court case rules against segregation. It overturns Plessy versus Ferguson and says basically separate but equal is inherently unequal, and that it violates the 14th Amendment. This is going to basically declare segregation, particularly in schools, unconstitutional. However, Southern schools are going to have a problem integrating, and we're not really going to have this integration we should right away. A lot of Southern schools in response are going to close temporarily, and violence against Blacks is on the rise. Eisenhower himself is going to start to integrate public schools. He is not the largest fan of the civil rights movement or equality for Blacks. However, he does know what the role of the president is. Most famous case of Eisenhower integrating public schools is going to be the Little Rock Nine. 9 in Arkansas, 9 Black children were supposed to attend the white high school, being the start of integration there. They were denied entrance to the public school, became a big deal. They were essentially blocked from entering the school, and eventually Eisenhower will use his power as president, and we've seen this before, presidents using this or actually not using it in the case of Jackson, but he's going to use his president to enforce the court's rule, which is to enforce integration. So he'll actually send the National Guard down to allow these students to go to school. Really brave, interesting case for these students to kind of a good example, and then we'll talk more about school segregation as it goes on because it's a really slow process. We also have an early civil rights. We have the Montgomery bus boycott. Rosa Parks, famously, you definitely want to know her. You probably should. In 1955, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white person on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. She is arrested for violating segregation laws, and this is going to lead to a massive protest of African Americans in Montgomery. Basically, African Americans are going to protest and boycott the entire bus system in Montgomery. The boycott goes on for a long time. It's a huge sacrifice for these people. A lot of them, buses are their main way, but they'd rather walk for miles than put up with this discrimination system any longer. You want to associate Martin Luther King Jr. with this movement. He's going to emerge. This is really where his leadership comes from. He's a Baptist minister, and he's going to help take a leadership and organizational role in the boycott. He's going to become known for his inspirational speeches and as a real leader of the boycott. Eventually, the boycott will end 1 year later when the Supreme Court rules that segregation on buses is unconstitutional. You also see Eisenhower pass the Civil Rights Act of 1957 and 1960. Both are pretty weak laws, and we'll talk about what Johnson's going to do to fix them. And both are pretty weak, generally because they just don't have the political motivations to get more passed. So that's kind of where we're going to end with early civil rights. I guess for both those laws, you can know that they gave the Justice Department new power, but the South is still really going to discriminate against Blacks and really going to push a lot of segregation, particularly stopping African Americans from voting. You also want to associate Martin Luther King Jr. He's going to form the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, which is going to be basically a lot of ministers, church leaders, to get behind the civil rights movement. It's going to become a powerful organization, and it's going to lead to nonviolent protest. So for nonviolent protests, probably the earliest, one of the best examples is going to be the sit-ins in Greensboro, North Carolina. You can actually go to the American History Museum and see the actual lunch counter stools where they sat. For the sit-ins, what you essentially want to know is that college students go to white-only counters and sit there. They work on their homework, they're polite, but they refuse to leave. They're asking to be served in a place where they're not supposed to be served. They're often arrested. It sends a powerful message because they're so well behaved, and then to see them kind of violently arrested is going to really make a lot of Americans say, hey, what's going on here? Students will lead a powerful role in the civil rights movement. You want to know SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and they're going to push the sit-in movement through all different kinds of places, not just lunch counters, but you'll also see it take place in libraries, swimming pools in particular, where a big discrimination plays, transportation, all kinds of things. And with transportation, that leads us to the Freedom Riders. The Freedom Riders in 1961 are young white and blacks are essentially going to ride buses in the segregated South together. They're going to face a lot of violence. And remember, this is the time period of TV. Seeing this violence on the TV does not look good for discrimination and for segregation. They're going to be arrested for breaking segregation laws, but they're going to continue to make a statement. Also, tragically, we have the bombing, the Birmingham church bombings. The KKK, still around, plants bombs in a church in Birmingham, and 4 Black girls are killed. It's going to lead to basically essentially race riots in Birmingham. A lot of violence breaks out because of these, and it's going to lead to a lot of people saying, you know, there's nothing worse than innocent children dying, and so it's going to gain more support for the movement. We also want to know that integration of schools happens also on the higher education level. You probably want to know George Wallace. He is pro-segregation and governor of Alabama. There's a very famous video of him saying segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation whenever. He's going to stop African Americans from attending class at the University of Alabama. James Meredith is denied entrance at the University of Mississippi, and there will actually be troops who will make sure that Meredith can enroll in the university. And then, obviously, most famously, we have the Million Man March, also known as the March on Washington. This is going to be where Martin Luther King delivers his famous I Have a Dream speech. You can actually go to the Lincoln Memorial. There's a spot where Martin Luther King stood. I believe it says I have a dream. This speech is really famous at the march. It's 1963, and he gives this speech. He's going to give it in front of Lincoln because Lincoln's the great emancipator. He's going to bring up language from the Declaration of Independence saying African Americans deserve the civil rights that had been promised in 1776. He's going to talk about hope, a world without discrimination, right? That he has a dream that his children won't face discrimination. And remember, King is all about passive resistance, nonviolence, civil disobedience. You could definitely see many of King's writings, letters from Birmingham jail, I Have a Dream, all as examples of his role in the movement and the nonviolence movement to make that happen. Kennedy, as we've talked about, these things all happened during Kennedy's presidency. He is sympathetic. He publicly says some things to kind of support Martin Luther King Jr., but he's slow to take action. And again, it's that coalition of Southern Democrats that's going to kind of stop him from taking a big stand because they're going to be against segregation. Johnson is crazy. He's a Southerner, but he's actually going to come in and get civil rights done. Remember, he builds off the goodwill established, or sadly established, from Kennedy's assassination, the popular support he has. He's going to get the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed. The Senate tried to filibuster for a long time, but Johnson, being the stubborn, determined politician he is going to make sure that Congress gets it passed. It ends all major forms of discrimination and segregation. It makes discrimination based on gender, race, religion, or national origin illegal. So it's not just African Americans that are benefiting from this, although that was essentially the main purpose. Civil rights are not granted immediately everywhere. And so, for example, this is when you see the March on Selma, right? In Alabama, they're not enforcing the Civil Rights Act. And so you'll see the famous March on Selma. I think we'll be watching the movie Selma later, but essentially they peacefully march to demand voting rights. They are met with tear gas and violence from the state troopers, not just like random guys, but government police officers, essentially. And that's going to bring a lot of attention to the cause. And because they were particularly looking for voting rights, we're going to later see the Voting Rights Act of 1965 passed. Remember, even though the 15th Amendment granted African Americans the right to vote, most were not registered or allowed to vote in the South. We've seen literacy tests, grandfather clauses, poll taxes, all kinds of tactics Southerners use to prevent them from voting. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 basically says you cannot discriminate at the polls, and is going to give the Justice Department power to enforce that in many ways. Johnson, remember I talked about this a little bit in class, but this, you want to make a note that you're going to start to see the switch in the South of Southern identification with the Democratic Party move towards the Republican Party. And you can kind of see on this chart, it doesn't happen overnight, but it's kind of a slow evolution over. We'll talk about it with Nixon's election in '68 and his Southern strategy. But a lot of Southern Democrats are going to feel betrayed essentially by Johnson's passing of this legislature, especially because Johnson himself is from the South. However, they're going to slowly kind of switch to the Republican Party over time. We'll see that change. It's kind of an interesting chart. We also see during Johnson, we start to see the difference between Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X is going to come up to kind of challenge King. Martin Luther King Jr., remember, is interracial cooperation, the idea of nonviolence, and his movement kind of starts to fraction at this time. We're going to start to see some race riots come out at this time, particularly in urban cities, northern urban cities, which are kind of, they don't have the Jim Crow discrimination, but they face a lot of discrimination. Remember, we saw a lot of whites move to the suburbs, and we've got a lot of poor inner city blacks dealing with a lot of problems. Malcolm X is an early radical separatist. He eventually, he has a really fascinating autobiography I had to read in college. Malcolm X, his really interesting life. He kind of shows the frustrations of those who are frustrated with the slow progress of King's movement. The X in his, he takes the last name X to stand for his lost African names. Remember, many slaves took, when they were freed, took their former master's name. He's pretty radical in the beginning. He later converts to Islam. He's going to take eventually a pilgrimage to Mecca and become a little more moderate. At the end, he will completely leave the Nation of Islam. So we kind of see a lot of different things. I think I have more on Malcolm X on the next page. Malcolm X, you want to associate him with Black Power. There are two things about Black Power. He wants to have greater pride in their racial heritage, and this is really when you start to see the term African American used, that idea of their racial heritage as an African American, where they come from. And you're also going to see Malcolm X not just focus on, or kind of draw away from Southern focus, but to focus on the plight of the inner city, for blacks in inner cities, particularly northern cities. You're going to start to see Black Power also identifies with self-separation and empowerment. So the idea that African Americans don't have to become like whites to get their rights. They can have pride in their culture and who they are and still deserve to be treated equally. You also want to associate Malcolm X and others with the Black Panthers. Black Panthers are originally started in Oakland, California. They are often seen as a radical militant activist group, although they slowly become kind of a political party, and then they really fragment. You'll see those that go towards a more violent method, and you'll see those that go towards more peaceful. Black Power and Black Panthers, this is still a small minority, like 15% of the movement. Although you should know a lot of people associated with the Black Power movement are going to not want whites involved. And that's going to be a big difference. Remember, like Freedom Riders or Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee were essentially integrated. They had white members. And so this is going to say, no, it's our fight. And I believe SNCC actually kicks out the whites. So we see kind of a different movement there, led by Malcolm X and others. You also want to know Stokely Carmichael. He joins Black Panthers and Black Power. He wants immediate civil rights, and again, he wants separation of blacks into their own separate communities. So he's going to be, he was part of the earlier movement, and he's going to kind of change. Malcolm X will be assassinated in 1965. Oh, I've got it written down right there. He's actually assassinated by Black opponents. In 1968, Martin Luther King Jr., he received the Nobel Peace Prize. He'd been leading peaceful marches. He was also, and this could come up on the AP exam as well, he starts to get involved in the anti-war protests. He believes a lot of young blacks are being forced to fight in this war that has nothing to do with them when they're being treated pretty terribly back in the United States. And King is assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. It leads to a lot of violence and riots after his assassination, and we'll talk about that. 1968 is a really violent year, and we'll talk more about that when we get there. So we've got a few issues going on with other groups. This isn't the most beautiful slide, but we can go over it. So let's talk about Native Americans first. Eisenhower's going to try and deal with the Native American issue. So Eisenhower in the 1950s tries to end the reservation system, to get American Indians to leave reservations and to try again for assimilation, something we've been talking about since before Jackson. A lot of Native Americans resist that. And so they actually formed their own movement. It's called the American Indian Movement, often AIM, AIM. Basically, what they're trying to do is basically protect Native American culture and fight racism. They try to help create jobs. They try to end poverty among Native Americans, fair treaties with the government, try and show like they face a lot of discrimination and hate crimes. Some parts of AIM take more violent methods, and you'll see like protests at the site of Wounded Knee, and so that kind of hurts the movement a little bit. You also see problems with discrimination against Latinos. They're going to face discrimination against in schools as well, particularly in California and the Southwest. And so you'll see a lot of those, especially from Mexican descent, be inspired by the civil rights movement. And we're going to see the Chicano movement, which is going to be student protesters, and they're looking for education reform, racial justice, and they're going to establish a pretty strong voting bloc, which we'll be talking about more. Again, they're going to also try and celebrate culture. And so you'll see like Puerto Rican pride parades. You'll see music, art. This is also the time of Cesar Chavez, who we'll talk about later, who's going to try and protect migrant workers. A lot of Latinos are doing migrant work during this time and still are. And so we're going to talk about their rights later on too. Other rights we're going to see is we're going to start to talk about the gay rights movement with the Stonewall riots, and we'll also talk about the women's rights movement, but I'm going to put those in the cultural sections. So that's about it for the civil rights movement. Let me know if you have any questions in class.